I moved into the house on the hill with high hopes. It was a dream come true for a young architect like me, a sprawling, old mansion surrounded by dense woods. The air smelled of pine, and the silence was only broken by birdsong. I spent my first day unpacking and admiring the intricate woodwork and tall windows. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. As night fell, I lit a fire in the living room and settled into an armchair with a book. The wind howled outside, but inside, I felt safe. Yet, just as I began to relax, I heard it, a faint creak from above. My heart skipped a beat. The sound came again, louder this time. I told myself it was just the old wood settling. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The creaking continued throughout the night, always coming from the attic. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it be an animal? A raccoon or a bird? Or was it something else? At midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath fogged in front of me. When I reached the top, I hesitated before opening the door. The attic was empty, just dusty furniture and cobwebs. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a presence behind me. Spinning around, I saw nothing but shadows. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, making me question my fears from the night before. Determined to put my mind at ease, I decided to explore every corner of the house in daylight. In the attic, I found an old trunk hidden beneath a sheet. Inside were faded photographs and letters dating back to the 1920s. They belonged to a woman named Eleanor who once lived here with her husband. The letters spoke of love but also hinted at betrayal and despair. One letter ended abruptly with a single line. Asterisk, he will never let me leave. Asterisk. A chill ran down my spine as I held the fragile paper in my hands. That night, as I worked on sketches in my study, I heard footsteps echoing in the hallway outside my door. My heart pounded as I slowly opened it, expecting to find nothing. But there it was, a shadowy figure at the end of the corridor. It stood still for a moment before disappearing into thin air. My legs felt like lead as I approached where it had been standing. There was no one there, but an icy draft brushed past me, carrying with it a faint whisper. Asterisk, help me. Asterisk. Shaking with fear, I locked myself in my room for the rest of the night. The next day, I drove into town to visit the local library and research the history of my house. The librarian seemed hesitant when I mentioned its name, but eventually handed me an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, Asterisk, Murder-Suicide Shocks Community. Asterisk. According to the article, Eleanor had been found dead in her bedroom under mysterious circumstances, while her husband vanished without a trace. Rumors suggested he had killed her out of jealousy before fleeing into the woods. My hands trembled as I read about their tragic end. That evening, as I brushed my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror, something caught my eye, a fleeting movement behind me. Turning quickly, there was nothing there. But when I looked back at the mirror, Eleanor's reflection stared at me from over my shoulder. Her face was pale and tear-streaked. Her eyes pleaded silently for help before fading away like smoke. Dropping my toothbrush in shock, I stumbled out of the bathroom and locked myself in my bedroom once again. Eleanor began appearing more frequently after that night, in mirrors, windows, even reflections on polished surfaces around the house. Each time she seemed more desperate than before, but never spoke aloud again after her first whisper in the hallway. It became clear she wanted something from me, something only I could do. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to search the house more thoroughly. Something told me there was more to Eleanor's story than the newspaper revealed. In the library, I noticed a draft coming from behind one of the bookshelves. After hours of effort, I managed to push it aside, revealing a hidden door. My pulse quickened as I turned the rusted knob and stepped inside. The room was small and suffocating, with faded wallpaper and a single chair in the center. On the floor lay a journal, its cover cracked with age. As I flipped through its pages, I realized it belonged to Eleanor. Her final entries spoke of fear. She believed her husband was planning to kill her. The last page was smeared with ink, as if written in haste. Asterisk, he locked me here. If you find this, please help me. Asterisk. The journal mentioned a basement that I hadn't yet explored. Armed with a flashlight, I descended into the cold, damp darkness. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the space, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. In one corner, I found an old trunk similar to the one in the attic. Inside were tools, a hammer, a saw, and a knife, all stained with dark, dried patches that made my stomach churn. Then I saw it, scratch marks on the stone walls, as if someone had tried desperately to escape. My breath caught as Eleanor's voice echoed faintly around me. Find him. Eleanor's journal hinted that her husband had fled into the woods after her death. That night, unable to sleep, I ventured outside with a lantern. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an oppressive silence. As I walked deeper into the trees, I stumbled upon an overgrown path leading to a crumbling shed. Inside, I found more evidence of her husband's madness, drawings scrawled on the walls depicting Eleanor's face twisted in agony. A pile of bones lay in one corner, human remains mixed with animal carcasses. Overwhelmed by dread, I fled back to the house. That night, Eleanor appeared again, this time in my bedroom mirror. Her eyes were filled with rage as she mouthed two words. Find him. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, and a shadowy figure emerged from the corner, a man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It was her husband's ghost. He lunged at me with unnatural speed, his hands like claws reaching for my throat. Eleanor's reflection screamed silently as she raised her hand toward him. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed the journal and threw it at his feet. He froze for a moment before dissolving into black smoke. With her husband's spirit banished, Eleanor's presence became calmer but no less insistent. She led me back to the basement where I discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was her skeletal remains wrapped in a tattered wedding dress. My heart broke as I realized she had been left here to die alone in darkness. The next morning, I contacted the authorities and gave them everything: the journal, her remains, and what little evidence remained of her husband's crimes. After Eleanor's body was buried in consecrated ground, the house grew quiet for the first time since I had moved in. No more creaks in the attic or whispers in the hallways, only peace. Yet sometimes at night, when the moonlight streams through my window, I think I see her standing by the edge of the woods. She doesn't look angry or desperate anymore, just grateful. As much as I loved this house once, I know now that it will never truly belong to me. It is Eleanor's home, and always will be. Fishing had always been my escape. The lake, surrounded by dense forest, was my sanctuary, a place where I could leave the noise of the world behind. The water was calm that evening, reflecting the orange hues of the setting sun. I cast my line and leaned back in my small boat, enjoying the solitude. But as dusk fell, a strange fog rolled in over the lake, thicker and colder than I'd ever seen before. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural silence replaced the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Then I saw her, a woman in a wedding dress standing on the shore, her veil fluttering in the wind. My heart skipped a beat. She shouldn't have been there. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but she didn't disappear. She stood motionless, staring out at the water. Something about her felt wrong. Her dress was soaked and clung to her body as if she had just walked out of the lake itself. I called out hesitantly, "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly toward me, and even from a distance, I could see her face, pale and lifeless, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Panic set in as I reeled in my line and rowed back to shore as fast as I could. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those empty eyes staring into my soul. Around midnight, I heard whispers outside my cabin by the lake. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was a woman's voice calling my name. Miguel. My blood ran cold. How could she know my name? Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside to find nothing but darkness and fog. Yet, as I turned to go back inside, I saw wet footprints leading from the lake to my porch. The next morning, still shaken from the night before, I went into town to ask about the woman by the lake. The locals were reluctant to talk at first, exchanging uneasy glances when I mentioned her. Finally, an older man pulled me aside and whispered, "You've seen her. the bride. He explained that decades ago, a young woman named Isabella had been left at the altar by her fiancé. Heartbroken and humiliated, she walked into the lake in her wedding dress and drowned herself. Since then, her spirit had been seen wandering near the water on misty nights. As he spoke, something clicked in my mind. My grandfather used to tell me stories about a bride who haunted this very lake when he was young. He always warned me never to fish after dark. Could it be possible that he knew more than he let on? Back at home, I searched through his old belongings and found an envelope labeled Isabella. Inside was a photograph of a beautiful young woman in a wedding dress, her face unmistakably that of the ghost I had seen. That evening, despite every instinct telling me not to go back to the lake, I did. This time, I stayed on shore instead of taking out my boat. As darkness fell and the fog returned, she appeared again, standing in the same spot as before. Her gaze locked onto mine immediately, this time as if she had been waiting for me. "What do you want?" I shouted into the night air. She raised one hand slowly and pointed toward the center of the lake before vanishing into thin air. The next day, unable to shake her silent command, I rented diving equipment from a nearby shop and prepared to search beneath the surface of the lake. The water was dark and murky as I descended into its depths. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom when something caught my eye, a glint of metal buried in silt at the bottom of the lake bed. I reached down and uncovered what appeared to be an old wedding ring engraved with initials. I and R. My heart raced as I realized it must have belonged to Isabella, or perhaps her fiancé. As soon as I touched it, a wave of cold swept over me despite being underwater. It felt like someone, or something, was watching me from every direction. Back on shore, I examined the ring more closely while trying to piece together what Isabella wanted from me. That night she appeared again, not on shore this time but standing waist deep in the water directly in front of me. Her voice echoed faintly across the lake. He lied. He killed me. My blood ran cold as realization dawned. Her fiancé hadn't left her. He had murdered her and staged it as suicide. The next morning, determined to uncover more about Isabella's tragic story, I confronted my father about what he knew of Grandpa's connection to her death. Reluctantly, he revealed that Grandpa had been friends with Isabella's fiancé and helped cover up what really happened all those years ago out of loyalty. Fueled by anger and guilt for my family's role in Isabella's suffering, and haunted by her restless spirit, I decided to take action. Among my grandfather's belongings, I found an old letter written by Isabella's fiancé, Ricardo, confessing to the crime. He had lured her to the lake under the guise of reconciliation, only to drown her in a fit of rage when she threatened to expose his infidelity. The letter was chilling, filled with justifications and excuses for his actions. I scanned the letter and anonymously sent it to local authorities along with a detailed account of Isabella's haunting. Though decades had passed, I hoped this would finally bring some form of justice to her memory. That night, I returned to the lake one last time, carrying the wedding ring I had retrieved from its depths. As the fog rolled in, Isabella appeared again, standing at the edge of the water. This time, she looked different. Her face was no longer twisted in anguish but calm and expectant. I held out the ring toward her and said, "I know what happened. He can't hurt you anymore." For a moment, she simply stared at me, her hollow eyes glistening with something that resembled tears. Then, from behind her, another figure emerged, the shadowy form of Ricardo. His face was contorted with rage as he lunged toward me. But before he could reach me, Isabella turned and raised her hand. A blinding light erupted from her palm, engulfing him in flames. His screams echoed across the lake as he dissolved into nothingness. When the light faded, Isabella stood alone on the shore, her expression serene. She stepped forward and gently took the ring from my hand, slipping it onto her finger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic like a distant song. Slowly, her figure began to fade into the mist until there was nothing left but the sound of rippling water. For the first time since I had moved here, the lake felt peaceful. No fog, no whispers, only silence and stillness. The next morning, news broke that authorities had reopened Isabella's case thanks to new evidence. Though no one could be prosecuted after so many years, her story was finally told, and her name was cleared. As for me, I still visit the lake sometimes, but it feels different now, lighter somehow. I like to think that Isabella has finally found peace, and maybe even forgiveness. I boarded the night train with a sense of excitement. It was my first time traveling alone to visit my grandmother in the countryside. The train was nearly empty, save for a few passengers scattered across the dimly lit carriages. I chose a window seat and watched as the city lights faded into darkness. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, and I soon found myself dozing off. But just as I began to drift into sleep, the train jolted violently, waking me with a start. Looking around, I noticed something odd. None of the other passengers seemed to react. They sat motionless, their faces eerily blank. The train slowed as it entered a long, dark tunnel. The windows turned pitch black, reflecting only the dim interior lights. I glanced at my fellow passengers again, but something had changed. Their reflections didn't match their movements. One man's reflection smiled while his real face remained expressionless. My stomach churned with unease. Suddenly, all the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. A cold wind swept through the carriage, carrying with it a faint whisper. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk. My heart raced as I gripped the edge of my seat. When the lights came back on, the carriage was empty. Every single passenger had vanished without a sound. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked down the aisle, calling out for anyone who might still be there. As I reached the next carriage, I froze in my tracks. A figure stood at the far end, a woman in an old-fashioned dress with her back turned to me. Her hair was long and tangled, and her shoulders shook as if she were crying. "Are you okay?" I asked hesitantly. She turned slowly to face me, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Before I could scream, she disappeared. I ran back to my seat, hoping this was some kind of nightmare I could wake up from. But when I looked out the window again, I realized we were still in the tunnel, endlessly moving forward but never emerging into open air. Panic set in as I searched for an emergency brake or a way to stop the train. The intercom crackled to life suddenly, and a distorted voice said, "Asterisk, you can't leave." Asterisk. My hands shook as I backed away from the speaker, feeling more trapped than ever. As I wandered through the carriages searching for answers or escape, I found someone sitting in one of the seats, an old man with a weathered face and sad eyes. "You see them too," he said without looking at me. "Who?" I asked nervously. "The ones who never left." He gestured toward the empty seats around us. "This train hasn't stopped in years," he continued. "We're all trapped here, some longer than others." His words sent chills down my spine. Desperate for answers, I pressed him for more information. "Why are we trapped? What happened to this train?" He sighed deeply before responding. "There was an accident, a derailment decades ago, but not everyone made it out." He paused before adding something that made my blood run cold. "Your grandmother was on this train once." My heart sank as memories flooded back of her, telling me stories about a mysterious train that only appeared at night. I decided to find the conductor's cabin, hoping it would hold some clue about how to escape this nightmare. The old man warned me not to go but offered no explanation why. Ignoring him, I pushed forward through more carriages that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Finally reaching the front of the train, I opened the door to find nothing. The cabin was empty except for a single lantern flickering on the dashboard and an old pocket watch ticking loudly on the floor. I picked up the watch and noticed an inscription on its back. Asterisk, time is not your ally. Asterisk. As soon as I touched it, visions flooded my mind. Images of passengers screaming as fire consumed them during the crash, shadows pulling others into darkness, and finally, my grandmother's face among them. Gasping for breath, I dropped the watch and stumbled backward into someone, or something, standing behind me. It was him, the conductor, but his face wasn't human anymore. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull. His eyes glowed faintly like embers in ash. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "This is their domain now." Before I could respond or run, he vanished into thin air, leaving behind only his hat on the floor. Returning to my seat in defeat, I found a note waiting for me that hadn't been there before. Asterisk, find what they lost. Asterisk. Confused but determined, I searched every carriage again until I found an old suitcase tucked beneath one of the seats. Inside were photographs of families, smiling faces frozen in time, and among them was one photo that made my heart stop. My grandmother as a young woman holding hands with another passenger. The old man reappeared as if summoned by my discovery. "She survived," he said softly when he saw what I'd found. "But she left something behind, a promise unfulfilled." He explained that my grandmother had promised to help free those trapped souls but never returned after escaping herself. Realizing what needed to be done, I gathered all the photographs and carried them to the lantern in the conductor's cabin. One by one, I burned them while whispering prayers for peace. As each photo turned to ash, ghostly figures appeared around me before dissolving into light. When all was done, sunlight streamed through the windows for the first time since entering that cursed tunnel. The train screeched to a halt at an abandoned station covered in vines and moss, but it felt like freedom nonetheless. As I stepped off onto solid ground again, I heard her voice faintly in the wind. "Thank you." I had always loved teaching, so when I was offered a position at an orphanage reopening after decades of abandonment, I eagerly accepted. The building was old but charming, nestled in the countryside far from the noise of the city. The children were shy at first but warmed up to me quickly. They seemed happy, though the place carried an eerie stillness that unsettled me. On my first night there, as I prepared lesson plans in my room, I heard faint laughter echoing through the halls. Smiling, I assumed it was the children playing. But when I checked, their dormitory was silent, and all of them were fast asleep. The next day, I asked the children if they had been up late playing games. They exchanged nervous glances before one of them whispered, "It wasn't us. It's them." Confused, I pressed for more details, but they refused to say anything else. That evening, as I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I felt a cold draft despite all the windows being shut. Suddenly, a ball rolled out from one of the empty classrooms and stopped at my feet. My heart raced as I peered inside the room. It was empty. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a soft giggle behind me. Determined to understand what was happening, I began exploring the orphanage more thoroughly during my free time. Most of the rooms were in use or had been cleaned out for renovations, but one door on the top floor remained locked. When I asked the headmistress about it, she grew pale and dismissed my question with a curt response, "That room is off limits." Her reaction only fueled my curiosity. That night, unable to sleep, I crept upstairs with a flashlight and tried the door again. To my surprise, it creaked open this time without resistance. Inside the room was a scene frozen in time. Dusty toys scattered across the floor, tiny chairs arranged in a circle as if waiting for children to return. The air was heavy with an unexplainable sadness. On one of the walls was a faded mural depicting smiling children playing under a bright sun. But as I looked closer, I noticed something disturbing. The eyes of some of the painted children were scratched out. A chill ran down my spine as I heard faint whispers around me. Asterisk, why did she leave us? Asterisk. The next morning, shaken by what I had experienced, I went into town to learn more about the orphanage's history. At the local library, an elderly librarian hesitated before handing me an old newspaper article. The headline read, Asterisk, Fire Claims Lives at St. Margaret's Orphanage. Asterisk. My stomach churned as I read about how a fire had broken out decades ago on the top floor during a stormy night. Several children had perished in their sleep while others escaped, but no one knew how it started. Rumors suggested negligence by the staff or even something more sinister. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, I stayed awake in bed replaying what I had read earlier. Around midnight, my lamp flickered and went out completely. In the darkness, I saw movement, a small figure standing at the foot of my bed. My breath caught in my throat as a little girl with hollow eyes stared up at me. "Why didn't you save us?" she whispered before vanishing into thin air. The next day at breakfast, one of the boys hesitantly approached me and said he had seen her too, the little girl who appeared at night. Slowly but surely, other children began sharing their experiences. Toys moving on their own, footsteps in empty hallways, and voices calling their names from dark corners. They called them the Forgotten Ones, spirits of children who had died in the fire and never moved on. As days passed and more strange occurrences unfolded, doors slamming shut on their own, shadows darting across walls, I began to feel an inexplicable connection to this place and its tragic past. Digging through old records in storage one afternoon, I found something that made my blood run cold, a photograph of my mother as a young girl standing among other orphans at St. Margaret's. She had never told me she lived here. I called my mother that evening to confront her about what I had discovered. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had been one of the survivors of the fire, but had never spoken about it out of guilt and fear. "They blamed me," she said softly over the phone. They thought it was my fault." My heart broke hearing her pain, but also filled with determination. I needed to help these lost souls find peace. Returning to the locked room on the top floor that night, I searched for anything that could explain what truly happened during that fateful fire. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was an old journal belonging to one of the caretakers at the time. Its entries revealed horrifying neglect, children left alone during storms while staff drank downstairs, and hinted that someone might have deliberately started the fire to cover up abuse. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront the forgotten ones, directly by returning to their room during another stormy night when activity was strongest. Sitting among their dusty toys under flickering candlelight felt both terrifying and heartbreaking as their ghostly forms began appearing around me, silent yet expectant. I read aloud from both journals, the caretaker's confession and my mother's account, acknowledging the pain these children had endured. My voice trembled as I apologized for the neglect and betrayal they had suffered, not just from the staff but from everyone who had forgotten them. "You were innocent," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You didn't deserve what happened to you." The room grew colder, and the ghostly children surrounded me, their translucent faces filled with sorrow. One by one, they began to smile faintly, as if my words had lifted a burden they had carried for decades. The little girl with hollow eyes stepped forward, holding out a charred teddy bear. "Will you stay with us?" she asked softly. My heart broke, but I shook my head. "You don't need me anymore. You're free now." As dawn broke, the orphanage felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its walls. The whispers and footsteps ceased, and the oppressive cold that had lingered in the air was gone. I knew the spirits of the forgotten children had finally moved on. Days later, I visited my mother and shared everything that had happened. She wept as I told her how I had helped bring peace to those she had left behind all those years ago. Together, we placed flowers at a memorial stone near the orphanage, honoring the children who had perished in the fire. Though I continued teaching there for some time, I never saw or felt their presence again. But sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees or sunlight streamed into their once-locked room, I liked to think it was their way of saying thank you. We laughed nervously, brushing off the strange sound as our imaginations running wild. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding us. "It's just the wind," Jake said, though his voice trembled. I wasn't so sure. Lying in my tent later that night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent. Then I heard something else, soft footsteps circling our campsite. My heart pounded as I held my breath, waiting for whatever, or whoever, it was to reveal itself. But nothing came. The next morning, we woke to find strange symbols carved into the trees around our campsite, circles with jagged lines cutting through them. None of us had seen them the day before. "Maybe some kids did this," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. As we explored further, we found more carvings leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, we decided to follow them, hoping they would lead to some kind of explanation. The air grew colder as we walked, and an eerie silence replaced the usual sounds of birds and insects. The carvings eventually led us to an old cabin hidden among the trees. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and its windows were broken and dark. "We shouldn't go in," I said, but Jake was already pushing open the creaking door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of decay. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like curtains. On a table in the center of the room lay an old journal with a cracked leather cover. As Sarah opened it, she gasped. "It's written in blood," she whispered. The journal belonged to someone named Elias, who had lived in the cabin decades ago. His entries spoke of hearing whispers in the woods and seeing shadowy figures watching him from afar. "They want me to leave," one entry read. "But I can't. I'm trapped." The final pages were frantic scribbles that made little sense. "They're coming. They're here. Don't trust them." As Sarah read aloud, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind us. We all jumped, our nerves fraying under the weight of fear. We decided to leave the cabin and head back to camp before nightfall, but something felt different about the woods now, as if they were alive and watching us. Shadows darted between the trees just out of sight, and every snap of a twig made us jump. The whispers returned, louder than ever and impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't have come." By the time we reached our campsite, it was clear we weren't alone anymore. That night was worse than any before it. The whispers grew into voices, angry and accusing, and strange lights flickered among the trees like will-o'-the-wisps. Around midnight, Jake left his tent to investigate a noise he claimed sounded like someone crying for help. He never came back. We searched for him until dawn but found no trace, only more of those strange carvings etched into trees where he had last been seen. With Jake gone and fear gripping us tightly, Sarah suggested we pack up and leave immediately. But as we tried to find our way back to the trailhead, it became clear that something, or someone, was leading us in circles. No matter which direction we walked, we always ended up back at our abandoned campsite. That evening, as darkness fell once more over the forest, we saw it for the first time, a tall figure shrouded in shadows standing just beyond the firelight's reach. Its eyes glowed faintly red as it watched us silently from afar. When Sarah tried to approach it with a flashlight in hand, it vanished into thin air. The next morning, Sarah was gone too, her tent empty except for her belongings scattered across the ground as if she had been taken in a hurry. Panic consumed me as I realized I was completely alone now with whatever haunted these woods. Desperate for answers, I flipped through Elias's journal again, scanning the frantic entries for something I might have missed. Toward the end, one line stood out. "The only way out is to give them what they want." My hands trembled as I read on. Elias had written about an ancient presence in the woods, something that thrived on fear and despair. It didn't want us to leave, it wanted us to suffer. The last entry was chilling. "If you hear the whispers, it's already too late. They've chosen you." My stomach churned as I realized that whatever had taken Jake and Sarah wasn't finished yet. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They seemed to echo inside my head, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Give us what we want." I shouted into the darkness, demanding to know what they wanted from me. The tall shadowy figure appeared again, closer this time, its glowing red eyes fixed on me. In a voice that sounded like 1,000 overlapping whispers, it spoke. "Your fear. Your soul." My knees buckled as I realized there was no escape. But then I remembered something Elias had written. "They feed on fear, but they cannot take what is freely given." Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I stepped forward and shouted, "Take it! Take everything!" The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers grew deafening as the shadowy figure lunged toward me. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I would vanish like Jake and Sarah. But instead of attacking, it stopped just inches from my face and dissolved into smoke. The forest fell silent, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. When dawn broke, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods near the trailhead. My friends were gone, there was no sign of Jake or Sarah, but I was alive. As I stumbled back to civilization, Elias's words echoed in my mind. "They cannot take what is freely given." Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I hear faint whispers in the distance. The woods let me go, but they never truly let you leave. When I received the letter about inheriting Blackwood Manor, I wasn't sure how to feel. My great-aunt Margaret, whom I barely knew, had left me the sprawling estate in her will. The house was infamous in the small town where it stood. Locals whispered about its dark history, but no one ever spoke openly about what had happened there. I arrived late in the afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows over the ivy-covered walls. The house was massive, with tall windows that seemed to watch me as I approached. Inside, the air was stale, and the wooden floors creaked under my every step. It felt like the house was alive, waiting for something, or someone. Exploring the manor, I found rooms filled with antique furniture and faded portraits of stern-looking ancestors. But one door on the second floor was locked. The key wasn't among the others I'd been given, and no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't budge. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint knocking coming from behind that door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder and more insistent. Gathering my courage, I approached the door and pressed my ear against it. A woman's voice whispered from the other side. "Asterisk, help me!" Asterisk. The next morning, determined to understand what was happening, I searched through old family records stored in the library. Among them was a portrait of a young woman with striking features and sad eyes. Her name was Eleanor Blackwood, my great-aunt Margaret's younger sister who had disappeared mysteriously decades ago. Rumors suggested she had run away or met with foul play, but no one knew for sure. As I stared at her portrait, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if her eyes were following me. While exploring further that day, I found a small music box hidden in a drawer in Eleanor's old bedroom. It looked ordinary enough until I wound it up and opened it. Instead of a cheerful melody, it played a haunting tune that sent shivers through me. As the music played, I noticed something strange. A faint outline of footprints appeared on the dusty floorboards leading toward the locked door upstairs. That night, unable to sleep, I decided to follow the footprints again. They stopped abruptly at a crack in the wall near Eleanor's room. Curious, I pried open a loose panel and found an old iron key hidden inside. My heart raced as I realized it might unlock the door upstairs. Clutching it tightly in my hand, I made my way to the second floor. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and with a click, the door creaked open. Inside was a small room filled with dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. In one corner stood a rocking chair that swayed gently despite there being no breeze. On a table lay an old diary with Eleanor's name scrawled on its cover. As I opened it, pages filled with frantic handwriting spilled out, entries about feeling watched and hearing voices in the house late at night. Eleanor's diary revealed a horrifying truth. She had been locked in this very room by her own family after accusing her brother of embezzling money from their estate. They claimed she was mentally unstable and confined her here for her own good. Her final entry read, **, they've abandoned me. I can hear them laughing downstairs while I waste away. **. My stomach churned as I realized she had died alone in this room. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled outside, Eleanor appeared for the first time. Her ghostly figure stood at the foot of my bed, pale and translucent, with tears streaming down her face. *Why didn't they help me?' she whispered before vanishing into thin air. My chest tightened with guilt, even though this tragedy had occurred long before my time. Determined to bring Eleanor peace, I confronted my family about what had happened to her during a phone call with my father. He hesitated before admitting that everyone had known about Eleanor's imprisonment, but chose to stay silent out of fear of scandal ruining their reputation. I decided to make amends by giving Eleanor a proper burial and exposing what my family had done to her all those years ago. With the help of local authorities, I gained permission to exhume her remains, which were still in the hidden room upstairs. The process was grim. Her skeletal remains were found beneath the floorboards, wrapped in a tattered blanket. I couldn't hold back tears as I realized how much she had suffered. The town's historical society agreed to help organize a small ceremony to honor Eleanor's memory and acknowledge the injustice she endured. But even as I worked toward giving her peace, the house seemed angrier. Doors slammed shut on their own, and whispers filled the halls at night. The night before Eleanor's burial, the house erupted with activity. Lights flickered, furniture moved on its own, and her ghost appeared again, this time more vividly than ever before. She stood in the hallway outside my bedroom, her face contorted with anguish. "They must pay," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "It wasn't just them," I pleaded. "I'm trying to help you now." But she shook her head, pointing toward the family portraits lining the walls. "Their blood is your blood," she whispered. "You carry their guilt." I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and for a moment, it felt like the house itself was trying to pull me into its darkness. Desperate to calm Eleanor's spirit, I sought advice from a local historian who specialized in folklore and hauntings. She suggested performing a ritual of atonement, a symbolic act to acknowledge Eleanor's suffering and formally ask for her forgiveness. That night, I returned to the hidden room with candles, flowers, and her diary. As I read aloud from its pages, apologizing for my family's cruelty and neglect, the room grew colder and darker. Eleanor appeared once more, her expression softer this time but still filled with sorrow. "Will they remember me?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I promised. "They'll know your story." The next morning, under a gray sky, Eleanor was finally laid to rest in the town cemetery. A small crowd gathered for the ceremony, locals who had heard about her tragic story and wanted to pay their respects. As her coffin was lowered into the ground, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Back at Blackwood Manor that evening, the house was eerily quiet for the first time since I arrived. No whispers, no slamming doors, just silence. As I packed my belongings to leave for good, I glanced at Eleanor's portrait one last time. Her expression seemed different now, less sorrowful and more serene. Though I would never forget what happened within those walls, I knew that Eleanor had finally found peace, and so had I.